Welcome back to the Bible Made Easy with Steve and Craig. In our last video, we looked at the Old Testament prophets, and that kind of finished our uh, survey of Old Testament scriptures. We began with the overall look at the Old Testament timeline, and then in the following lessons, we kind of broke down different sections and looked at that uh, the period of the Old Testament in greater detail. As I mentioned, the last lesson was the prophets, and I had given you this chart that shows you that the prophets prophesied during the time of the divided kingdom, captivity. Then after the return, you had Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the last prophet to prophesy before this 400-year silence that separates the Old and the New Testament. We said this is a period where there's going to be no inspired writer, but that silence will eventually be broken with the coming of John the Baptist. But I also mentioned in the last video that God did not leave us without instruction about what was going to happen during those 400 years, because especially to Daniel, God had prophesied the events that are going to take place really from the time of captivity to the time of Christ. I'd mentioned earlier when we talked about the prophets that Isaiah and Micah were contemporaries, that Micah was the country prophet and Isaiah was close to the king, so he's known as the prophet of the court. Well, the same thing is true when you look at Ezekiel and Daniel, because Ezekiel is going to be found out by the river Kibar among their captives that were taken from the Canaan land into Babylonian captivity. But Daniel's going to be always close to the king. When he was a young boy, he was taken by Nebuchadnezzar in 606. He and his companions, because of their intelligence, were trained in service to the king. So Daniel, for 70 years, through the 70 years of captivity, served the kings of Babylon. But then because of the intelligence found in him, when the Persians came to power, Daniel continued to serve the kings of Persia. So when you study the book of Daniel, you're going to see many references to the Babylonian kings and then later to the kings of the Medes and Persians. Now, in the book of Daniel chapter 2, during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar is going to have a dream that none of his wise men are going to be able to interpret. But Daniel, after praying with his friend, God reveals to Daniel interpretation, and that's a great line in the Bible. When he's finally brought before Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar asked him, he said, "Oh, Daniel, are you able to interpret my dream?" And he says to Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "No one in the flesh can interpret your dream, but he said, there is a God in heaven, and he has revealed to the king the things that will take place after this." So Daniel goes on to tell Nebuchadnezzar that what he dreamed was, he saw a great image. His head was of gold, his arms and chest of silver, his belly of bronze, and his legs of iron and clay. And then he saw a stone that was cut out without hands that hit this image on the feet and break it into pieces. And that image was then became like chaff, and the wind scattered it away. But that stone that had hit the image on the feet then grew into a great mountain and filled the earth. And then Daniel gave the interpretation. He told Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "You are the head of gold." And he said, "And after you shall rise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then another third kingdom that shall rule over the earth, and then a fourth kingdom." And he said, "And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up his kingdom that will never be destroyed." So that's a great explanation of what's going to take place from the time of the captivity to the time of Christ, that there's going to be four great empires. And they're going to be Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But more importantly is that stone that was cut out without hands. He said that stone that hit the image on the feet and then grew into a great mountain. He said, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up his kingdom that will never be destroyed. And we know that was fulfilled when Jesus established the church in the days of the Roman Empire. And what a perfect description for the church and the growth of the church. And that is that it hit the image on the feet, and it was just a stone. And Christianity didn't begin in Rome or some important city in the empire, but in a far off land of Judea there in a small province, and with the preaching of Jesus and this guy from Galilee. But from that beginnings, Christianity began, and of course, we know, of course, filled the whole earth. Another important thing is that he said this is a kingdom that would stand forever. And that's because it's different than those other kingdoms. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome are going to be some of the greatest empires the world will ever know. But as great as they were, they all fell because they were earthly kingdoms. And the reason that God's kingdom will stand forever is because his kingdom or church is spiritual. And of course, it's continued to exist since the first century, since the days of the Roman Empire. And let's look at that detail. I had mentioned before that there's so much information in this period between the Testaments that will probably take several lessons to cover it. But I'm just going to give you a general overview today of the events that took place during that 400-year period between the Old and New Testament. I have another important chart. I'll put it up for you to do a screenshot because it's something I'm sure you're going to want to refer to more. So here's your chart. See if you can just do a screenshot of that. Because what you notice is that after the fall of Babylon, we've already mentioned when we were covering our Old Testament timeline that the Babylon fell to the Persians. Well, the Persians are actually going to rule the world for 200 years. And then when the Greeks are going to come to power under Alexander the Great, they're going to rule the world for 300 years. And this is, of course, going to lead us up to the time of the Roman Empire, when Jesus is going to come, the church is going to begin, and of course, Rome will continue for a few hundred years longer. But during this Persian period, it takes place during the last part of the biblical record. It's some events we've already recovered, how in 536 God's people were able to return from captivity, and that Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, led a group of 50,000 back and reestablished the city of Jerusalem and laid the foundation of the temple. We talked about the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, who in 520 encouraged the people to rebuild the temple, which was completed in 516 BC. We looked at the time of Esther, who was, of course, queen of Persia. Ezra the scribe, who led a second group of captives back. We saw Nehemiah, cupbearer to the king of Persia, who led a third group back and helped to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And of course, then Malachi, that brings an end to the Old Testament period. And then we enter this period of biblical silence, and the things taking place are way off there in Macedonia and Greece. We have the Spartans come to power. This is the time men like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And this is an important event. Philip of Macedonia, he unites the Greek states. And the reason that's important, because it sets the stage for his son, Alexander, to become the one who's going to conquer the world. So Alexander, with his small force, is going to be able to defeat the mighty Persian Empire. And in future videos, we're going to look at some more details, because these things are prophesied in more detail in the book of Daniel. But Alexander is going to rule for just a short period of time. He's going to conquer the entire Persian Empire. But tragically, when his troops get to what they consider the end of the world, to the borders of India, they were ready to turn back. And on the return journey, it says that Alexander caught a fever in Babylon and died. Now, they don't know for sure if he was poisoned or it was an actual fever, but anyway, Alexander died at a young age, and then his kingdom is going to be divided among his 4 generals, 2 of whom are going to be very important, the Ptolemy and the Seleucid rulers, because the Ptolemies are going to rule Egypt, and the Seleucid rulers are going to rule Syria. And these are going to be the ones that dominate God's people in the land of Palestine during this 400-year period. Now, there's going to be a brief time, which we'll look at in detail in the future, the time of the Maccabees, when Israel is going to gain a certain amount of independence, but they're really always going to be under the control of these foreign powers. And then what's happening as you get into the 200 BCs, you begin to see, just like you saw the Greeks rise earlier, now you're going to see the Romans start to come to power. Rome is going to win some decisive victories. Carthage is going to be defeated at Zama. Rome is going to defeat the Macedonians in Pydana. And then by 146, Rome is going to control the Western Mediterranean. And so then you get into the period of the Roman period, beginning about 63 BC. And this is going to be the time when Pompey is going to conquer Jerusalem. A man by the name of Antipater of Idumea is going to be given rule of Palestine under Rome. And he's actually going to be a descendant of the Edomites. And of course then his son Herod is going to be declared Herod the Great and going to rule over all Palestine. And he's going to start building the temple that's going to be destroyed in AD 70, and also beginning Masada. And he did some other magnificent building work. Herod was not a very good person, but he was a great builder. And we can see why he was so nervous in the New Testament when wise men came to the east and say, we've come to worship him who's born King of the Jews, because he knew he was not legitimately, didn't have a legitimate title to the throne, because he was an Edomite, not actually an Israelite. Around 47, this is going to be the time that Cleopatra is going to begin to rule in Egypt. She's going to be a descendant of the line of the Ptolemies. So actually, she wasn't an Egyptian, she would have been a Syrian. And then we're going to lead up to the time of Julius Caesar. He's going to be murdered in 44 BC. Rome is going to capture Egypt. This is going to be the time of Antony and Cleopatra. That's when they're going to commit suicide there for rebelling against Rome. And 28 is going to be time that Augustus Caesar rules in Rome. And of course, this leads us to the time Jesus is going to be born. Of course, Herod is going to kill the infants. And then when Herod dies, Palestine is going to be divided among his sons. And that's going to be the background that we'll deal with further when we get to the New Testament period. But that's kind of an overall view of that 400-year period. So you had the Persians reigning for 200 years, the Greeks for 300 years, and then beginning in 63, we get into the time of Rome. Now, just quickly before we close, I'm going to give you a look at the maps of what had happened during this time. Of course, we had looked earlier at the Babylonian Empire, and then we also looked at the map of the Persians, this great Persian Empire that rose up, conquering Babylon. And I've mentioned in a couple of videos, this is Cyrus's cylinder, great archaeological find that tells about the fall of Babylon to the Persians. And then I had to get a bigger map to show the Empire of Alexander, because Alexander is going to begin here in Macedonia and Greece, go into what we know as modern day Turkey. He's going to conquer, all the biblical lands, and he's going to conquer what's modern day Iraq and Iran, clear to the borders of India. And of course, when Rome comes to power, they're going to extend their kingdom far to the west, including what is now known as Spain, and then all the way up to modern day Britain. So I hope this lesson has been interesting, and we'll be looking at this 400-year period in a little more detail in the next few videos. Thank you.